The security footage captured everything: the calm before the storm, the unassuming moments before chaos erupted. 5 co-workers, each unaware that their final day had arrived, moved through the office as if nothing was wrong. But in the shadows of that ordinary workspace, she was watching, calculating, waiting for the right moment to strike. When the first body was found, authorities thought it was a tragic accident. By the time they realized the truth, the office had become a crime scene drenched in blood. What could drive a 21-year-old woman to execute such a brutal act? Was it rage, revenge, or something far more chilling? The answers lay within the walls of that Ohio workplace, and as investigators unraveled the events of that fateful day, they uncovered a story darker than anyone could have imagined. March 18, 2023 started like any other day at Linton Manufacturing, a small factory on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. The morning shift clocked in at 6 a.m., and by 6:15 the machines were running, filling the warehouse with the hum of industry. Workers moved through their routine, some focused on their stations, others chatting in the break room, sipping coffee from paper cups. No one had any reason to believe that by noon, 5 of them would be dead. Among the employees was Rebecca Holloway, a 21-year-old assembly line worker. She had been employed at Linton for just over a year, showing up every morning without fail. She wasn't particularly social, keeping interactions with her co-workers minimal, but she wasn't unfriendly either. If asked, her colleagues would have described her as quiet, reserved. Someone who preferred to keep to herself, but there had always been something about her that made people uneasy. Rebecca wasn't the type to stand out. She had a slim build, shoulder-length dirty blonde hair that she rarely styled, and light brown eyes that always seemed distant. Her uniform, like everyone else's, consisted of a navy pool jumpsuit, but hers was always a little wrinkled, as if she never cared enough to iron it. She hardly ever smiled. When she did, it looked forced, as though she were mimicking what she thought a normal expression should be. That morning, Rebecca arrived at work as usual, clocking in at exactly 5:57 a.m. She walked straight to her locker, retrieved her gloves, and moved to her station without speaking to anyone. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed something different about her. Something in the way she carried herself, a stiffness in her posture, a certain rigidity in her movements. At 9:45 a.m., Rebecca took her break like the rest of the employees. She sat alone at a small table near the vending machines, eating the same thing she always did, an apple and a peanut butter sandwich. Her co-workers paid her little attention, except for Jessica Martin, a 34-year-old supervisor who had been keeping an eye on Rebecca for some time. Jessica had noticed small, strange behaviors: how Rebecca never made eye contact, how she seemed to zone out for long periods, how she sometimes whispered under her breath when she thought no one was listening. Jessica had planned to speak with Rebecca that day, maybe ask if she was okay, but she never got the chance. At exactly 10:12 a.m., the first shot rang out. Linton Manufacturing had never experienced anything like it before. The sound of the gunfire echoed through the metal walls of the warehouse, sending workers into a panic. The first victim was David Carter, a 42-year-old father of 3 who had been working the same line as Rebecca. He never saw it coming. One moment he was adjusting a piece of machinery, the next he was on the ground, a gunshot wound in his chest. Panic erupted instantly. Some employees ran for cover, while others froze, too shocked to react. A few seconds later, another shot rang out. The second victim was Laura Benson, a 28-year-old quality control inspector. She had been standing just a few feet away from Rebecca when she was shot in the back. She collapsed onto the concrete floor, gasping for air as blood pooled beneath her. By now, people were screaming. Workers were shoving their way toward the exits, desperate to escape. But Rebecca wasn't done. She turned and fired again. The third victim was Michael Trent, a 50-year-old machinist. The bullet struck him in the side of the head, killing him instantly. His body hit the ground with a sickening thud, his safety goggles skidding across the floor. The fourth victim, Sandra Lopez, tried to run. She almost made it, but Rebecca fired 2 more rounds, striking her in the upper back. Sandra collapsed just inches from the doorway. By now, the factory floor was nearly empty. Those who had managed to escape had fled into the parking lot, frantically dialing 911. The police would later estimate that the entire attack lasted less than 3 minutes. The final victim was Jessica Martin. Jessica had been hiding behind a stack of shipping pallets, hoping Rebecca wouldn't see her. But as the gunfire stopped, she made the mistake of looking up. Their eyes met. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She raised the gun and pulled the trigger. Jessica fell backward, her body limp, her lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. For a moment, the factory was silent, except for the distant wail of approaching sirens. Rebecca stood there, breathing heavily, the gun still in her hand. Then, without any sign of remorse, she placed the weapon on a nearby workbench and calmly walked toward the exit. She made it as far as the parking lot before the police arrived. Officers rushed in, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Rebecca didn't resist. She simply raised her hands, allowing them to take her into custody without a struggle. By 10:30 a.m., the massacre was over. 5 people lay dead inside Linton Manufacturing. The woman responsible sat in the back of a police car, her face expressionless. What had driven Rebecca Holloway to commit such a brutal act? That was the question investigators and the entire city of Columbus spent the next several months trying to answer. Rebecca Holloway sat in the interrogation room of the Columbus Police Department, her wrists bound by metal cuffs that barely seemed to register in her mind. She hadn't spoken since she was taken into custody, and the officers watching her through the one-way glass couldn't make sense of her demeanor. No tears, no remorse, no visible fear. Just a blank stare at the metal table in front of her. Detective Alan Grayson, a 20-year veteran of the force, had seen his share of cold-blooded killers. But something about Rebecca unsettled him. Most suspects in mass shootings either broke down in regret, raged in defiance, or offered justifications laced with bitterness. Rebecca did none of that. She simply waited, her hands resting on the table as if she were a student awaiting instructions in a classroom. The evidence against her was undeniable. Surveillance footage captured the entire crime, from the moment she retrieved the gun from her locker to the second she placed it on the workbench after killing Jessica Martin. Ballistics confirmed that every shot had been fired from the weapon registered in her name, an old .38 revolver legally purchased months before the attack. The news spread fast, shaking Ohio to its core. Major news outlets broadcasted the footage repeatedly, dissecting her every move, her every action. Experts speculated about her possible motives. Some suggested workplace bullying, others theorized an undiagnosed mental illness. Social media swirled with theories ranging from personal vendettas to the influence of violent online content. But no one had answers, and Rebecca wasn't giving any. When Grayson finally entered the room, he carried a thick folder filled with crime scene photos and witness statements. He pulled up a chair, studied her for a moment, and set the folder down with deliberate force. Still, she didn't react. He began reading off the names of the victims, one by one, pausing between each. No flinch, no flicker of recognition, nothing. "Rebecca," he said at last, folding his arms. "5 people are dead. Tell me why." Silence. An hour passed. Then 2. Grayson tried everything. Direct confrontation, appeals to her humanity, even long stretches of silence, hoping she'd feel compelled to fill the void with words. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, the forensic team was combing through Rebecca's life, searching for anything that might explain what had pushed her to commit mass murder. They scoured her phone records, her emails, her search history. They interviewed her co-workers, her old classmates, her neighbors. The portrait they painted was of a young woman who had always been an outsider. Rebecca had grown up in foster care, bouncing from one home to another after her biological parents overdosed when she was 4. She had no close friends, no romantic relationships, no criminal record. She kept to herself, rarely socializing beyond what was necessary. Her co-workers described her as odd, but never aggressive. Then, investigators uncovered something chilling. In a small spiral-bound notebook found in her apartment, Rebecca had written hundreds of pages detailing fantasies of violence. The entries weren't frantic scribbles or disjointed thoughts. They were methodical. She described, in disturbingly calm language, various ways she had imagined killing people. She wrote about what it would feel like. She listed specific names. Some of those names matched her victims. One passage stood out among the rest. Emily don't see me, they never have. But they will. When the noise stops, when the blood spreads across the floor, they'll remember my name, even if it's the last thing they ever hear. Enjoying the documentary? Why not subscribe to the channel for more intriguing and interesting true crime stories? It was a confession without being one. A carefully documented descent into the mind of someone who had spent years planning her moment. By the time detectives pieced it all together, Rebecca was already on her way to trial. Public interest in the case skyrocketed. Every network ran deep dive specials, psychologists weighed in with expert opinions, and armchair detectives on social media picked apart every detail. Was she born this way, or had something pushed her over the edge? Was she a cold-blooded killer, or a deeply broken individual who had been ignored for too long? During her arraignment, she pleaded not guilty, forcing the case to move forward with a full trial. The prosecution wasted no time laying out its case. They presented the surveillance footage, the forensic evidence, and her detailed notebook, painting her as a remorseless executioner who had carried out a calculated plan. Her defense team attempted to argue diminished capacity, citing her isolated upbringing and possible undiagnosed mental disorders, but even they struggled to justify her complete lack of emotional response. Throughout the proceedings, Rebecca remained emotionless. She never cried, never reacted. Even when victim impact statements were read aloud, family members sobbing as they described their grief, she sat still, her expression never changing. It wasn't until the final day of testimony that the first sign of emotion emerged. When the prosecutor asked, "Did you regret it, Rebecca? Do you feel anything for the people you killed?" For the first time since her arrest, she smirked, just for a second, just enough for the jury to see. It was all they needed. 3 hours later, the verdict was returned. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to life without parole, ensuring she would never walk free again. But even as the courtroom erupted in relief and anger, even as reporters scrambled to file breaking news updates, one question remained unanswered. Why? Rebecca never explained. She never wrote another word about it in her notebooks, never spoke a single sentence about her motivations. In the end, the world would remember the crime, but the reason behind it would remain a mystery. Rebecca Holloway sat in her prison cell at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, staring at the ceiling as the echoes of the day's events faded into the distant hum of the facility. The trial was over. The world had condemned her. News anchors dissected her every move, while psychologists debated whether she was born evil or molded into a monster by circumstance. But none of it mattered to her. She had accepted her fate the moment she pulled the trigger. The prison guards watched her with a mix of caution and unease. Unlike most inmates who lashed out, cried, or tried to bargain their way to a lighter sentence, Rebecca moved through the prison halls like a ghost. She never complained, never raised her voice, never showed an ounce of fear. The other inmates whispered about her at night, calling her names. The Ice Queen, the Reaper, the girl with dead eyes. But Rebecca didn't care. Life in prison followed a strict routine. Wake up, eat, work, return to the cell, repeat. The guards monitored her closely, but she gave them no reason for concern. She didn't fight. She didn't join gangs. She didn't form alliances. She was alone, just as she had been her entire life. One evening, an inmate named Carla Sanchez, serving time for armed robbery, approached Rebecca in the common area. Carla had seen many types of criminals, but Rebecca unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. It wasn't just her silence. It was the absence of something. Emotion, regret, humanity. "Will you do it?" Carla finally asked, watching Rebecca's expression for any sign of life. Rebecca turned her head slightly, her eyes locking onto Carla's. A long pause stretched between them before Rebecca finally spoke, her voice quiet, almost too soft to hear. "Them and I were in my way." That was all she said. Carla didn't press for more. She simply walked away, shaking her head. But inside the prison, Rebecca's notoriety only grew. Some inmates feared her, others admired her, and a few even tried to befriend her, hoping to unlock the mystery of what had driven her to kill 5 people in cold blood. None succeeded. Then, 3 months into her sentence, something happened that shook the entire facility. One morning, during routine head count, a corrections officer found Rebecca sitting cross-legged on her bed, staring at the wall. Nothing seemed out of place at first, until the officer noticed the words written on the wall in red ink. Namely, never listened, they never cared, they only saw me when it was too late. The officer's stomach tightened. Rebecca wasn't allowed to have pens in her cell. When they searched the room, they discovered the ink wasn't ink at all, it was blood, her own. She had bitten into her fingertips, using them like a brush to scrawl the words across the white painted bricks. Prison staff rushed her to the infirmary, where doctors bandaged her hands. The wounds weren't deep, just enough to draw blood. When questioned, Rebecca refused to answer. She didn't scream, she didn't beg. She just stared at the doctor as if he weren't even there. Psychologists were brought in to evaluate her, trying to determine whether she was suicidal, but Rebecca made no attempts to harm herself further. She ate when she was told. She followed orders. She never lashed out. Still, the prison administration moved her to solitary confinement, fearing she might escalate. Locked away in a concrete room with no windows, no distractions, no human interaction, Rebecca should have broken down. Inmates placed in isolation often screamed through the nights, losing their grip on reality after weeks without conversation. But Rebecca never made a sound. For 45 days, she sat alone in her cell, her only company the dim light flickering from the hallway. Guards monitored her closely, expecting her to snap. But she didn't. She remained still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. Then, on the 46th day, an officer checking the security cameras noticed something chilling. Rebecca was smiling. It wasn't a wide, crazed grin. It was subtle. Just a slight curve of her lips. But it was enough to send a shiver down the officer's spine. That same day, prison officials decided to move her back into the general population. They couldn't justify keeping her in solitary any longer without cause. But something had changed. Inmates who once whispered about her now avoided her completely. Even the toughest women in the facility refused to meet her gaze. Rumors spread. Some claimed Rebecca had spoken to something in the dark. Others swore they heard faint laughter coming from her cell in the dead of night. A few weeks later, the prison warden received an unexpected call. It was from a true crime journalist, eager to secure an exclusive interview with Rebecca for a documentary on female killers. The warden hesitated. Rebecca had refused every media request so far, but the journalist was persistent, promising to approach her in a way no one else had. To everyone's shock, Rebecca agreed. On the day of the interview, a small camera crew set up in a secure room. Rebecca was led inside, her wrists shackled, her posture calm. The journalist, a seasoned interviewer named Eli Carter, wasted no time. He asked about her childhood. She offered vague responses. He pressed about her time in foster care. She shrugged. But when he finally asked about the murders, something shifted. For the first time, Rebecca's gaze locked onto the camera lens. "Emily always acts surprised," she said, her voice even, her expression neutral. "Who?" Ellie asked. Rebecca tilted her head slightly. "The ones who ignore people like me." That was the last thing she said before prison officials cut the interview short. The footage aired a month later, sparking nationwide debate. Was Rebecca a product of her environment? A girl who had been neglected until she snapped? Or had she been dangerous all along, her quiet demeanor merely a mask for something darker? The debate raged for years, but Rebecca never spoke of it again. She spent the rest of her life behind bars, never seeking parole, never attempting escape, and to this day, no one knows if she ever felt a shred of remorse. Page 4. Years passed, but Rebecca Holloway remained an enigma. While other inmates adjusted to the slow rhythm of prison life, forming alliances, stirring conflicts, and seeking redemption, she remained an island, untouched by the passage of time. Guards and inmates alike speculated about her thoughts, but no one ever got close enough to find out. She never participated in fights, she never sought favors, she never showed signs of fear or regret. To those who observed her, it was as though she had resigned herself to the walls of the penitentiary long before she was convicted. Prison officials attempted various psychological assessments, trying to determine what lay beneath her controlled exterior. Some doctors suspected she was suppressing deep trauma, while others believed she simply lacked the ability to feel emotions like normal people. But no diagnosis ever fully explained her. She was neither fully broken nor entirely whole. Then something strange happened. One morning, an officer arrived at her cell for routine checks. As the heavy iron door creaked open, he was met with a sight that sent a ripple of unease through the facility. Rebecca stood in the middle of the room, staring at the small mirror attached to the wall. She wasn't brushing her hair or adjusting her jumpsuit. She wasn't even looking at her reflection. She was looking past it. The guard hesitated before clearing his throat. "Holloway, you good?" She didn't answer. He took a step forward, eyes scanning the cell. Nothing seemed out of place, but something about the atmosphere felt off. Then, just as he was about to repeat himself, Rebecca smiled. A slow, knowing expression stretched across her face, and for the first time in years she spoke without being prompted. "Did you hear them?" she asked. The guard's skin crawled. "Hear who?" She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. Emily always come back. The officer had heard his share of cryptic remarks from inmates, but something about the way she said it lingered in his mind, long after he left her cell. A week later, Rebecca disappeared. Not physically, her body was still inside the prison, but mentally, she wasn't there anymore. She stopped speaking. She stopped responding to orders. She wouldn't even blink when guards tried to provoke a reaction. Doctors examined her, but she showed no signs of medical distress. It was as if she had simply chosen to disconnect from the world. Even during meal times, she barely moved. Food was left on her tray untouched. Water remained undrunk. Days stretched into weeks, and then one morning she was found collapsed on the floor of her cell. Paramedics were called. The prison warden personally oversaw the emergency response. But Rebecca wasn't dead. She was awake, silent, unmoving, expressionless. As medical staff checked her vitals, one of the nurses noticed something chilling. There was a word carved into her left forearm, not deep enough to cause critical damage, but precise enough to make an impact. It read, "Listen." No sharp objects were allowed in her cell. No weapons had been reported missing. Yet there it was. The prison launched an internal investigation. Surveillance footage was reviewed. No one had entered her cell during the night. No signs of self-harm were visible before she collapsed. The mark seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Inmates whispered about it for months. Some claimed she had finally lost touch with reality. Others insisted she was trying to send a message. A few even believed something supernatural had been at play, but Rebecca never explained. She was placed under medical observation for the next 2 months. Yet she never acknowledged what had happened. Then, without warning, she spoke again. It happened during an interview with a prison counselor who had been assigned to assess her mental state. For 40 minutes, Rebecca sat in silence as the counselor asked routine questions. Then, just as he was about to wrap up, she leaned forward slightly and whispered, "Do you think they'll ever understand?" The counselor froze. "Understand what?" Rebecca tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked onto his. "The price of ignoring someone like me." That was the last thing she ever said to anyone. Weeks later, she was found dead in her cell. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play, no indication of suicide. The cause of death was officially ruled as cardiac arrest, but many questioned the accuracy of the report. Her death only fueled the mystery surrounding her. Reporters speculated about her final moments. Some suggested she had simply willed herself to die. Others believed the weight of her crimes had finally caught up with her. But those who had spent time inside the prison weren't so sure. Inmates swore that in the days leading up to her death, they heard whispers coming from her cell, whispers that didn't belong to her. A guard who had worked at the facility for over 2 decades requested a transfer soon after, claiming he couldn't shake the feeling that Rebecca had never been alone in that cell. And then there was the final piece of evidence, something that was never made public. When officers entered her room to remove her body, they found something written on the wall in what appeared to be her own blood. It was a single sentence. _ they should have listened. _ Rebecca Holloway's story faded into the archives of true crime history, Her case remained one of the most unsettling criminal events in Ohio's modern history. But even now, some say that if you visit the prison where she spent her final days, you might still hear her voice in the dead of night. A whisper in the dark, waiting for someone to listen. Would you stay alone in that cell for one night, or would you leave before the whispers start? Subscribe for more true crime stories that will keep you up at night.